In July 1889, a woman hung from a pine tree in Wyoming for 2.5 days in the summer heat. Her name was Ellen Watson. She was 29 years old. She owned a legal homestead. She had purchased cattle with documented receipts. She had applied for a marriage license. She had filed for water rights. She had registered her own cattle brand. Everything she did was legal. Everything she did was documented. Everything she did followed the law. And for that, 6 wealthy cattlemen lynched her. Then, they convinced newspapers to call her Cattle Kate, a cattle-rustling prostitute who got what she deserved. The lie stuck for over 100 years. Historians repeated it. Hollywood filmed it. Even her own family stopped speaking her name. This is the story of what really happened to Ellen Watson. Not the legend, not the myth Hollywood sold you. The truth. And the truth is darker than any Western ever showed. Ellen Liddy Watson was born on July 2, 1861, in Ontario, Canada. When she was 16, her family moved to Smith County, Kansas, and homesteaded land near Lebanon. At 18, she married William Pickle, a neighbor's son. The marriage was a disaster. Pickle was a violent drunk. He beat Ellen regularly. After one particularly brutal beating with a horsewhip, Ellen ran. She went back to her family's farm, filed for divorce, and never looked back. In 1886, Ellen moved to Rawlins, Wyoming, a rough railroad town where she could disappear and start over. She found work as a cook at the Rawlins House, the best boarding establishment in town. On February 24, 1886, a man named James Averill walked into the Rawlins house. He was there to file a homestead claim for land along the Sweetwater River, about 60 miles east of Rawlins. The land sat near Independence Rock, where the Oregon Trail, the Mormon Trail, and the California Trail all converged. Averill had opened a restaurant and general store on his homestead. He needed a cook. Ellen took the job. They fell in love. In May 1886, they applied for a marriage license in Lander, but they kept the marriage quiet. Maybe they married in secret, maybe they didn't marry at all. Because if Ellen stayed single, she could file her own homestead claim. Married women couldn't do that. Together, as a married couple, they'd only get one homestead. Separately, they could claim 320 acres. In March 1888, Ellen filed her official homestead claim with the land office in Cheyenne, 160 acres adjacent to Jim's property. The land controlled water on Horse Creek, a tributary of the Sweetwater River. In Wyoming's dry climate, water meant everything. Without water, you couldn't grow hay. Without hay, your cattle died in winter. Ellen's homestead sat on land that a wealthy cattleman named Albert John Bothwell had been using illegally as free pasture for years. Bothwell didn't own that land. He had no legal title to it except for the small parcel his house sat on. But he'd fenced 60 miles of public range with barbed wire and treated it like his personal kingdom. When Ellen filed her claim, she blocked his water access. Bothwell made several offers to buy her land. Ellen refused every time. That was her first mistake, saying no to a cattle baron in 1880s Wyoming. To understand what happened next, you need to understand the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. Founded in 1872, the WSGA was the most powerful political force in Wyoming territory. Its members weren't just cattlemen. They were bankers, state representatives, judges. They controlled the territorial legislature. They controlled the newspapers. They controlled the courts. The association ran Wyoming like a private fiefdom. They created laws that protected big ranchers and crushed small homesteaders. They made it nearly impossible for small operators to legally own cattle. First, the association required every rancher to register a cattle brand. The cost was exorbitant, designed to keep out poor farmers and cowboys who wanted to start their own herds. Even worse, brands had to be accepted by a committee controlled by the association. They rejected applications from small ranchers as a matter of course. Ellen and Jim applied for 5 different brands over 3 years. The association rejected them every single time. In December 1888, Ellen tried again, applying for a brand called WT through the Carbon County Brand Committee in Rawlins. They rejected her, so Ellen outsmarted them. In March 1889, she bought a previously registered brand, LU, from a neighbor named John Crowder who was moving away. The brand was a play on her name. LU sounded like Ella. She officially registered the LU brand with the Carbon County Brand Commission on March 20th, 1889. Now, she could legally mark her own cattle. That was her second mistake, finding a way around the association's rules. By summer 1889, Ellen had 41 head of cattle branded with her LU mark. She'd started the previous year with 28 head she'd purchased from a man driving cattle from Nebraska to Salt Lake. The cattle were footsore and in poor condition. The man sold them cheap because they couldn't travel further. Ellen had receipts for everything. She'd made the purchases at the Hugus Bank in Rawlins. Everything was documented and legal. But the association looked at those 41 head and saw something else. They saw a woman with her own land, her own water rights, her own cattle brand, and her own growing herd. They saw someone who didn't need their permission to exist. That couldn't stand. July 20th, 1889, a Saturday. That morning, a range detective named George Henderson rode through Ellen's pasture. He saw cattle with fresh LU brands. Henderson was a member of the Stock Association. He rode straight to Albert Bothwell and told him Ellen might be illegally branding cattle. Bothwell knew Ellen had owned those cattle for almost a year. He knew she had receipts, but he didn't care. He sent riders to gather other cattlemen for an urgent meeting. By mid-afternoon, 6 men had gathered: Albert Bothwell, Tom's son, John Durbin, Robert Connor, Ernest McLean, and Robert Galbraith. These weren't cowboys. They were wealthy ranchers, pillars of the community. Bothwell was a postmaster and merchant. Durbin was a pillar of the Methodist Church in Cheyenne. Son was an old pioneer scout and guide. They decided to take matters into their own hands. At Ellen's homestead, 2 teenage boys were working. Gene Crowder, an 11-year-old Ellen had unofficially adopted, and John DeCory, a 14-year-old hired hand. The boys watched as John Durbin tore down Ellen's barbed wire fence and drove her cattle out. McLean and Connor grabbed Ellen and forced her into a wagon. She screamed and fought. She tried to explain that Bothwell knew she'd bought the cattle legally. They told her to shut up or they'd shoot her. They said they were taking her to Rawlins to stand trial. Gene Crowder rode for help. He found Jim Averill's place and told him what happened. Then he found Frank Buchanan, a neighbor and friend. Meanwhile, the cattleman's wagon intercepted Jim Averill on the road to Casper. He was going for supplies. They told him they had a warrant for his arrest. Jim demanded to see it. Durbin and Bothwell drew their guns. The warrant, they said, was the rifle barrel pointed at his chest. They forced Jim into the wagon beside Ellen. Frank Buchanan mounted his horse and followed. He stayed far back, watching. The cattlemen drove north to a gulch near the Sweetwater River. They stopped beneath a stunted pine tree growing from a rocky ledge. Buchanan watched from behind some rocks as Bothwell tied a rope to the tree. He watched McLean put a noose around Ellen's neck. He watched them place Jim and Ellen on a low rock beneath the tree. Then Buchanan opened fire. He hit John Durbin in the hip. The cattlemen returned fire with rifles. Buchanan was outnumbered 6-1. He ran out of ammunition. He was forced to retreat. He crouched behind the rocks and watched Ellen and Jim die. The cattlemen pushed them off the rock. The drop wasn't high enough to break their necks. They strangled slowly, struggling to free themselves, their feet kicking at empty air. Ellen Watson and James Averill hung from that tree for 2.5 days in the July heat before anyone cut them down. The same day of the lynching, July 20th, 1889, George Henderson received a telegram. He immediately went to the offices of the Cheyenne Daily Sun and then to other newspapers controlled by the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. The next morning, those papers published lurid accounts of the crimes of a prostitute and cattle rustler named Cattle Kate Maxwell and her partner in crime, James Averill. Cheyenne Daily Sun editor Ed Towse wrote a 1,300-word article justifying the lawless but justifiable deed. He wrote that Averill was always feared because he was a murderous coward. He wrote that Watson, whom he called Kate Maxwell, was a virago who had accepted stolen cattle as payment for sexual services. Towse concluded, "The cattlemen have been forced to this, and more hangings will follow unless there is less thieving." It was the first time the cattlemen had used the press as a weapon to justify murder. The tactic worked so well, they'd use it again in 1891 and 1892 during the Johnson County War. The articles spread fast. Similar stories ran in Denver, Omaha, Chicago, and New York. Papers across the country repeated the same false facts. Ellen Watson was a notorious cattle rustler and prostitute known as Cattle Kate. She ran a brothel where she accepted stolen cattle as payment. She was violent, foul-mouthed, dangerous. She'd gotten what she deserved. Almost none of it was true. Ellen Watson was never called Cattle Kate during her lifetime. The name came from confusion with a possibly fictitious woman named Kate Maxwell, a heavy-drinking saloon owner in Bessemer, Wyoming, who may or may not have existed. Ellen never ran a brothel. She lived in a 2-room cabin she'd built herself near Horse Creek. She cooked meals at Jim's restaurant for 50 cents each. She worked her homestead. She raised cattle legally purchased with documented receipts. She was described as tall for her time, probably around 5 feet 8 inches, with brown hair, blue eyes, and a charming Celtic brogue. Neighbors who knew her said she was gentle, kind, hard-working. When a neighbor fell sick, Ellen stayed for several days to care for her. But none of that made it into the newspapers. The Stock Growers Association had written the story they wanted the world to believe, and for over 100 years, the world believed it. On July 26, 1889, 6 days after the lynching, a coroner's inquest was held. The findings were clear. Ellen Watson and James Averill had died by strangulation at the hands of Albert Bothwell, John Durbin, Tom Sun, Robert Connor, Robert Galbraith, and Ernest McLean. County Sheriff Frank Hatzel arrested all 6 men. They were charged with murder, and then they posted bail, $5,000 each, paid for by other members of the Stock Association, and went home. A grand jury was scheduled for August 25, 1889. But before the trial could begin, something strange started happening. The witnesses began to disappear. Gene Crowder, the 11-year-old boy Ellen had adopted, vanished, never seen again. Some said his father, a drifter and heavy drinker, heard what happened and took Gene away to protect him from the powerful cattlemen. Others whispered darker explanations. John DeCory, the 14-year-old hired hand who witnessed Ellen's abduction, allegedly went to Steamboat Springs, Colorado. He was never summoned for the hearing. Frank Buchanan, the only eyewitness to the actual lynching, disappeared next. He was last seen in protective custody in Cheyenne. A notebook found years later in a Kansas City attic told the rest of his story. Buchanan spent the next 2 years wandering the country, hiding from the cattlemen, terrified for his life. Ralph Cole, Jim Averill's 20-year-old nephew from Wisconsin, died mysteriously on the very day of the scheduled hearing, possibly from poisoning. By October 1889, when the grand jury finally convened, there were no witnesses left alive or willing to testify. The jury consisted of 16 people. 7 were cattlemen. The charges were dropped. All 6 men walked free. In 1890, the year after Ellen's death, Albert Bothwell was elected to the executive committee of the Wyoming Stock Growers Association. So was Tom Sun. Captain Galbraith was elected to the territorial legislature. John Durbin served on association committees for years. Bothwell acquired both Ellen's and Jim's homesteads, the land he'd wanted all along. He moved his house onto what had been Ellen's property, the land he'd murdered her to get. He lived without any legal repercussion, no trial, no punishment, no consequences. In the 1920s, Bothwell retired to Los Angeles and died peacefully in 1928. Ellen Watson's family couldn't fight back. The newspapers kept printing stories about her being a prostitute and a rustler. Her father, Thomas Watson, traveled from Kansas to Wyoming after the lynching to find out what happened. When he returned home and the stories continued, he forbade his family to ever speak Ellen's name again. For decades, historians accepted the newspaper accounts as fact. Books published in the 1920s, 1940s, and 1950s repeated the same lies. Even Helena Huntington Smith's 1966 book, The War on Powder River, a thorough history of the Johnson County War, stated that Ellen was a prostitute who accepted recompense for her favors in the form of stolen yearlings. The false version became entrenched. Michael Cimino's 1980 film Heaven's Gate told a fictionalized version where Ellen, played by Isabel Huppert, runs a brothel that accepts rustled cattle as payment. It wasn't until the 1990s that the truth finally emerged. George Huffsmith, a composer and Wyoming legislator, began researching Ellen Watson's life in the 1970s for an opera he was writing about the lynching. He went to the original sources. He examined land records. He found Ellen's homestead applications, her cattle brand registration, her marriage license application, her water rights filings. He contacted Ellen's descendants. He read the testimony of the boys who witnessed her abduction. He found Frank Buchanan's notebook describing his years in hiding. He compared the accounts in the Cheyenne papers, controlled by the Stock Association, with the accounts in the Casper and Rawlins papers. What he found was simple. Ellen Watson was telling the truth. She had bought her cattle legally. She had documented receipts. She had registered her brand legally. She owned her land legally. And the Wyoming Stock Growers Association had murdered her for it. Huffsmith's research culminated in his 1993 book, The Wyoming Lynching of Cattle Kate. It was the first thorough debunking of the century-old lies. In 1989, on the 100th anniversary of Ellen's death, her family erected a memorial marker at her gravesite. The marker tells the truth. Ellen Watson was not a criminal. She was a homesteader murdered by powerful men who wanted her land. The lynching of Ellen Watson and James Averill was a turning point in Wyoming history. It showed how far the cattle barons would go to maintain control. It showed that the law meant nothing when you had enough money and political power. And it set the stage for something even worse. In April 1892, about 50 Wyoming ranchers and hired Texas gunmen invaded Johnson County in northern Wyoming. They came with a list of 70 men they planned to kill, small ranchers and homesteaders accused of rustling. The invasion lasted for days. It ended only when the U.S. cavalry intervened. That event became known as the Johnson County War. And it happened because the Watson-Averill lynching had taught the cattle barons a valuable lesson. They could get away with murder. The Wyoming that Ellen Watson knew was a place where women could vote but couldn't own land safely, where small homesteaders had legal rights on paper but no protection in reality, where newspapers served power instead of truth, where witnesses disappeared and grand juries looked the other way. Ellen Watson didn't fit the frontier mythology. She wasn't a helpless woman waiting to be rescued. She wasn't a school marm or a prostitute. She was a businesswoman who wanted to own property, raise cattle, and live independently. She escaped an abusive marriage, moved across territories alone, filed legal claims, registered her brand, and built a life on her own terms. And for that, the most powerful men in Wyoming killed her. Then, they spent a century lying about who she was. Today, there's a strange irony in how Ellen Watson is remembered. The name Cattle Kate endures. It's catchy. It's alliterative. It fits the Western legend. But Ellen Watson was never called that name while she was alive. It was invented by newspaper editors working for the men who murdered her. Even sympathetic retellings often use the nickname. Even historians trying to clear her name call her Cattle Kate. The smear campaign was so effective that the lie became more famous than the truth. But the truth matters. Ellen Watson was a 29-year-old woman who followed every law, filed every document correctly, kept every receipt, and did everything right. She was murdered anyway. Her killers were arrested, charged, and freed. They lived long, prosperous lives. They became leaders in the community. They died peacefully in their beds. Ellen hung from a tree for 2.5 days. This is what frontier justice actually looked like. Not the clean-cut morality of Western films, not the lone lawman facing down outlaws. This was rich men using violence to control resources and using newspapers to rewrite history. Ellen Watson's story matters because it shows how power actually worked on the frontier. It matters because it took a century to correct the record. It matters because even now, the lies are more famous than the truth. Every time someone says "Cattlecade," they're repeating a smear campaign invented by murderers. Every time a history book describes her as a rustler without examining the evidence, they're doing the killer's work for them. Ellen Watson deserves better. She deserves to be remembered by her real name. She deserves to be remembered for what she actually was, a hard-working homesteader who had the courage to say no to powerful men. On July the 20th, 1889, in a gulch near the Sweetwater River in Wyoming Territory, 6 wealthy cattlemen lynched a woman for wanting to own land. Her name was Ellen Watson, not Cattle Kate. Ellen Watson. And more than a century after her death, we finally know the truth.